I want to first really congratulate CFA and particularly Madhavi and Priya for putting together what many of our organizations have written on the bill before us. I think this is necessary hard work, which gives us in a way the first document to go forward from here, and I'm glad that today we're able to put something in the public domain. Let me also say this, that of course many of our organizations, all of our organizations present here made submissions to the Parliamentary Standing Committee, which we're bound by parliamentary privilege and therefore have not circulated them widely. So this is our effort to try and begin this discussion that goes beyond our organizations. I want to try and address, I think, the larger context in which we're faced. I'm not sure many of you would recall the headline Monday morning in some of our financial papers, which said that the Niti Aayog had put together a health policy 2017, which is going to build the Indian secondary and tertiary healthcare system through PPP. This is in a sense where I think where we are located as a society and as an economy. My comrade Franco shared some months ago a clip with us in which Narendra Mody says the public sector is created to destroy itself. And I think, to be fair to Narendra Mody, in that context he was being honest. He was actually speaking from what he believes in. And I think whether it's the health system or it's the banking system and everything after a fashion that lies in between that would address the need of ordinary working people is, as far as Narendra Mody and the BJP government is concerned, meant to be placed at the disposal of the private sector for profit. And I think this is not something that we can treat lightly. I think if we just if I go back a week earlier, there is a deal for fighter jets. This is with Dassault Corporation to buy Rafales, and I'm not even going to get into the question of corruption or otherwise. But that there is, at the end of the day, a state-backed transfer and technology agreement with a private business house known, I think, as the Anil Dhirubhai Ambani Group, which today is on the edge of bankruptcy. So when we're talking about, I don't know, if just for those who haven't picked this up, bankers were meeting today to discuss the insolvency of Anil Ambani's flagship company called Reliance Communications. Yeah? This is the old Reliance Telecom, the old Reliance mobile company that tried to sell telephones with embedded technology, which tied you into Reliance Communication. So this is in a sense of, I think, today where public policy locates itself. If we look at it from the lives of the so-called organized sector, which is workers or employees who actually have formal contracts, who have appointment, who receive a fair wage, who receive some retirement benefits in terms of provident funds, some healthcare benefits in terms of ESI, or perhaps better still, if that exists. We're looking today in the framework of choice. We're actually looking at that entire mechanism of provident fund and ESI being demobilized and handed over to the private sector. I've said this before, and I will say this again. This is not just about public sector banks. If one looks at the entire corpus of money in terms of savings of working people in the middle class in the public sector banks, combined with the Provident Fund and the ESI, then we're looking at a colossal corpus. And in a way, it is this corpus that has stood till today between the Indian people and the capitalist class, both Indian and global. And 25 plus years into the neoliberal project, it is this combined corpus that is sought to be demobilized. That's only one part of it. If I think about the other element, and this is a speech Narendra Modi made in the early days of his government, announcing announcing legislation that would make self-compliance and self-certification the rule of the day for labor law implementation. And I wish I could play that speech to you, but in that speech he actually said, it was in fact almost a little over, it was in October 2014, in that speech in Vigyan Bhavan, launching the first of his sort of labor reform, so to speak, he said, we don't need an inspection to test whether a car is roadworthy or not, whether its brakes work or whether its clutch works. Why do we need an inspector for a boiler? Mr. Modi unfortunately belongs to a class of people who are at best described as neoliterates. In the advanced parts of the world, cars beyond a certain age are actually required to undergo a motor vehicle test for their roadworthiness. And the advanced parts of the world include countries that still we believe are with us in the global south, a country like China, middle income group countries such as Brazil, and some of the least developed countries amongst the in the Committee of Developed Nations, countries like Greece, Portugal, all have motor vehicle tests of cars beyond the age of between 5 and 10 years. But let me leave the motor vehicle test out for a moment. It's worth recalling that in Uttar Pradesh, less than a month ago, countless, and literally countless, workers died in an NTPC boiler blast. And this is the boiler the neoliterate Mr. Narendra Modi was talking about. Why is there a boiler act? Why is there a boiler act not just in this country, but in every industrial country of the world? Why has there been a boiler act since the 1920s? Because it is a hazardous piece of equipment which is highly susceptible to accidents. It requires inspection, it requires third-party certification, and in fact today we have manufacturing, be it public sector or private sector, that's leading this country to the edge. This is in a way the celebration, and that's why I think I would say he's a neoliterate, because it's a chalta hai culture. ठीक है बॉयलर फट गया, ठीक है अगली बार नहीं फटेगा, अगली बार थोड़ा सावधानी से चलाना. It's not like cycling, telling your son to cycle carefully on Rafi Marg at peak hour. And when I say countless, the official count is 39. Anybody who's worked on a boiler of the scale that existed in that power plant will tell you that the fly ash destroys cantilevers, floors, and the very floor in which it is installed. And it is, I think NTPC officers have been on record and then quickly backed off, that there is a possibility that several unnamed, unknown, unaccounted for contract workers very quickly after the accident got buried under the fly ash. Let me, if I can take this one step further, I think we've also seen, or one step backward if you go into chronology, we've seen an amendment of the Coal Act, which not just privatized coal, but also, and in the first incident moved into ordinance, but also for the first time, and I think this is the crucial part about mining in India, and mining in most parts of the world, that coal was traditionally viewed as something that was a necessity that would connect it with production, primarily for the creation of electricity and for the manufacture of iron and steel. And therefore coal mines, or coal blocks as they were called, were issued as license to those outside of the public sector who were engaged in the manufacture, in the generation of electricity, or in the manufacture of iron and steel. And that had a certain meaning. The meaning was coal was not for trade and commerce as a good in itself. What the amendment to the Coal Act of 2014, or I forget, it was the ordinance of 2014 and the amendment in early 2015, actually does is it allows private companies that have got hold of coal mines to sell a part of of what they've mined in the private sector. We could go, whether it's healthcare benefits, whether it's retirement funds, whether it's how electricity will be generated, how coal will be mined in this country. If we've said for 25 years that the government is engaged in sale of society's assets, I think today we're at the cusp of something we've never witnessed before. It's systematically, sector by sector, a part of the economy by part of the economy, that we're faced with it being taken apart. It's not very clear whether we've as yet succeeded on the land question. This government again sought very early in its life in 2014 through 2 successive ordinances to amend what we popularly know as the Land Acquisition Act, which of course was rephrased to be the Rehabilitation, Resettlement, etc. Act. But given the way the BJP looks at lawmaking and policy making, there are already efforts to amend it at the state level in the state of Jharkhand. And we can imagine that BJP state governments in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Rajasthan will do that. Yeah? So after a fashion, if we stretch this, it goes back to the very core natural resources of livelihood that exist, that for which there is an attempt to create an institutional and legislative space in order to pass these resources and assets into the private domain. I think it's worth thinking about that if we look at the attempt at changing the entire financial landscape of this country with actually what the so-called insolvency code does. We all recognize that the global crisis of 2008, and it's not just we on the left who recognize, but even neoliberals, even neoclassical economists recognize that the global crisis, financial crisis of 2008 was a product of the financialization of the economy. We've come to that 10 years late, or 10 years after the crisis. What does the insolvency bill seek to do? The insolvency bill seeks to convert valuable manufacturing assets into financial tradables. Which means that when a Jyoti or SR or JP steel plant is taken apart, I can take the boiler and Usha can take the furnace. And what we lose in that is actually a steel plant. And the steel plant is not the property of Jyoti or SR or whoever, JP. The steel plant is an asset. The company may be somebody's property, but the plant is an asset of this society. Because that plant, of the scale that it is, came, so to speak, on our land, was built with our resources, it displaced thousands. And because these people were not astute enough businessmen, that's the kindest thing you can say about them, or they engaged in whole-scale graft by over-invoicing the machinery they bought from abroad, that they ran up debts which bankrupted their companies. What is bankrupt is the company. What is who should pay for this is the shareholder of that company. Not those who lost their land, not those who've given up who lost their land and became contract workers who are now losing their jobs. And not society at large, because we also paid valuable foreign exchange for that machinery. Banks are merely today an extension of that paradigm of financialization. That if there's something wrong with a bank, what does reconciliation mean? Sorry, what's the corporation called? The RC? Reconciliation Corporation. Is that it? Resolution. What does resolution mean? Resolution means to tweak the balance sheet. Many of you here are bankers. You know what tweaking balance sheets are. Your creditors are constantly coming to you with tweaked balance sheets. It's about fixing a balance sheet and making it look good, and if you can't fix it well enough, then what do? Then you liquidate the bank. I think it's not just about the history of the public sector. And I would be the last person in today's world to stand in ceremony over the nationalization of 1969. It was a very important step, but I recognize that the balance of force in our world today is very different, and there's very little point in standing up merely for the symbolism of supporting the decision of 1969. But even if we were hypothetically to say that we are not, and I would reserve this, I would say only hypothetically, if we say hypothetically that we are not going to stand on ceremony about public and private, the fact of the matter is that the financial system of this country runs through the public sector. And it runs not just because on paper it's owned by the public sector, but there is an entire framework of regulation that ensures that to whatever extent possible, banking services, and that is not just taking deposits but also issuing loans, reach every section of the economy. It is not just about those of us who have deposits in the public sector banks, but it's actually about keeping the wheels of motion of this economy running. Bank denationalization, if demonetization place this economy in peril in the short to medium term, if the GST has placed this economy in peril in the medium to long term, then bank denationalization will derail this economy to a point in the future that I don't think anybody who understands this economy can actually say how it will revive. Because we have a robust financial sector in the private sector, but that robust private sector actually caters to a very small part of the economy. It does not cater to this country's non-urban needs, and I think that's the first point that needs to be recognized. It neither has the capacity to do so, nor does it have the will to do so. If we were to actually put in the rules that are put in to motivate public sector banks to enter rural areas, we'll actually see capital flight from the private sector banks, from the ICICIs and the HDFCs. These are banks who don't make their money on the spread, to use your language, but they make money from what are called, from unearned source, from fee-based services. Who pays fees? Corporates. Yeah? And when I say, and Madhuresh says that it's about the backbone of the economy, it's a statistically verifiable fact that the vast bulk of private savings in this country go into public sector banks. Directly and indirectly, either directly into public sector banks or through cooperative banks or through regional banks, etc., 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 which are finally all protected by, co-financed by, determined by a larger public sector bank. Second, there's an important part of the economy, the rural economy, which is dependent exclusively on the public sector. But there's a point that my hypothetical point must go away, that I'm value neutral between public and private. And the fact is that if this economy is to grow, it can only grow through the public sector, with the public sector, and by the public sector. It's the capacity of the public sector, be it the treasury or be it public sector institutions, that actually that mobilize resources for economic growth in our economy. We're living actually in a perilous situation. The BJP government shouted from the rooftop in 2014 that they would create an economy that ensured the ease of doing business. The index may have gone up, but actually we're faced with the greatest investment crisis ever after the early 1960s. Private investment in the Indian economy is declining, and declining quite rapidly. Something that this government would loathe to come into the public domain, but it will in the next few days, that public investment has actually been rising rapidly under this government. This government, for the private sector, public spending, not public investment, sorry, I have somebody correcting me. Public spending has been rising. What that means is actually the government is consuming in order to try and prime this economy. So we're actually in the midst of a economic crisis, when what we have is a government that's saying, keep taking the institutions down, keep putting public assets in the private sector, keep opening up every area that is not yet open to the private sector, and that's what's going to drive the economy. I'm going to conclude by saying, I don't believe, and that's why I tried to, it may have been labored to go through some of the economy sector by sector. I don't believe this battle is just about public sector banks. but this battle is about public sector banks too. And that's why we share this platform with IBOC and with NAPM. And that's a fight, like every fight, be it the fight of coal mining, be it the fight of the NTPC workers in UP. These are all fights we're going to have to fight together, and that's the only way that we can go forward from here. Thank you.